Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Denise Parsonage. I am one of the people business partners here at GitLab, and I support, work really closely with the sales organization. Juliana, my partner in crime here, is also a PvP. We're excited to talk to you about the 360 process and specifically around feedback. You know, as you all know, feedback is a gift, and as managers, it's super important for you to be prepared and to be able to digest and deliver the feedback that is coming through the 360 for your direct reports. So in the agenda doc, you'll see the timeline, and we are here, which is really thinking about that feedback phase for our direct teams. Hopefully you've had some time to do the pre-work, which is to look at the feedback process here at GitLab, read through the handbook, and do the GitLab Learn course. This session, we are happy to answer any questions about the overall process, but one of the things that we really love about these sessions is to break out into breakout rooms and talk about some scenarios that you might be faced with in terms of giving feedback to your team members. Before we do the breakouts, are there any questions based on the pre-work or anything related to the 360 process that you would like to verbalize?
Denise, for someone who hasn't done this before, about how much time should we allocate per individual feedback?
That's a really good question. For me, are you asking how much time to deliver the feedback or to prep for the feedback?
Well, I'm assuming in the tool we have to write the feedback. So on average, like how much does it take, an hour per person? Is it less? Is it more? If we want to budget our time so we know that we have a looming deadline by the 4th.
Yeah. So in terms of supplying feedback to those that you're supplying to in the tool, I think an hour is probably the max. You have prompts on start, stop, continue, and some, you know, specific areas that you're going to be providing feedback on, and preparing to deliver the kind of overall report to your team member, because you're the coach in this situation. You get their full 360 feedback, and you're reviewing that for themes and overall feedback from all of the raters. You probably need a little bit more time to digest that and plan your approach. Juliana, anything to add?
Yeah, I would align with that. And I think it probably also depends on how closely you worked with the team member that you're providing the feedback to. For direct report, it may be more. For a peer that you've worked with less, it'll probably be less, just depending on the amount of feedback you have to provide. But I would agree with Denise's estimation of about an hour per person.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Vicky? Okay. So what, and we are going to come back together after the breakout so we can kind of tackle some additional questions then. But what we found in these types of sessions, we've done this around like talent assessment and other subjects. It's really great to have that peer learning and discussion and do that in a safe place in breakout rooms. We know that sometimes it's daunting. These are, you may have not ever had to give feedback like this before, but please know, all of us have been there at one stage in our career, and this is about learning and learning from each other. So there's no bad answer or wrong answer. Everyone can contribute, and we really want to just make sure that there's a great dialogue in these breakout rooms. There's also, these are just 3 scenarios that we've picked that we've seen, you know, show up. There may be others that you want to discuss, but we do have a time focus here. So we want to collect notes below in the agenda doc for your respective groups. We'll spend about 5 minutes on each scenario. If we need, we'll check in. We may need some more time. And then we'll come back together and read out about the scenario. So it's written down in the agenda doc here, which what we'll be looking for to hear from you, key takeaways from each scenario from the breakout rooms. Sounds good? Okay, so Juliana's going to do the magic of breakout or Zoom rooms. And we'll pop in, we can float between rooms and see how y'all are doing and if you are getting stuck anywhere.
And we'll pause the recording ahead of the breakout room, so those discussions y'all have are not recorded, and then we'll resume for the discussion. So we'll go ahead and put y'all in those rooms now. All right. It looks like everyone is back. Thanks so much for taking the time to review the scenarios and discuss. Looking at the notes, it looks like y'all had some great conversations. For the next 15 minutes, we'll go through your key takeaways on each of the scenarios, kicking off with scenario 1. Feel free to also ask questions. This is meant to just kind of align on key takeaways, how we would approach it. And if questions arise from that, we're happy to answer them too. So does anyone want to kick off with thoughts on scenario 1, the values alignment scenario?
Sure. We were in breakout room 2. Patrick made the point that, the feedback being delayed for a week, if he was waiting on doing that feedback up to a week, that he's really always tried to share feedback immediately, and might want to have that conversation sooner rather than later to eliminate the element of surprise. And Alex was saying, if you haven't observed the behavior itself, it might not be a surprise for Tanuki when you bring this up to that person. Patrick brought up situation, behavior, impact approach. So what he's heard versus validation. Lyle suggested doing your independent research, which everybody agreed on, so that you're not just going by hearsay or secondhand information. Alex agreed, getting more data points, digging in and validating to see if others have shared similar experiences, obviously in a confidential manner. And Patrick mentioned that we should avoid the I heard statements, give the team member the agency to solve their problem, to work as a coach in that scenario, but give them the ability to, to kind of relay their thoughts and behave as the coach. And Jeff asked about what aspects of diversity, inclusion, and belonging are in the feedback. And I mentioned, if it's really egregious behavior, then obviously you have to address it immediately. If it's something that somebody's just completely outside the scope of acceptable behavior, you need to step in right away.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that, there are different kind of levels in terms of what unacceptable behavior is. And our code of conduct would be another consideration here. If it's something like Annie highlighted, something really just not at all appropriate and a violation of the code of conduct, we would need to loop into team member relations and such as well. So depending on the level of severity, the approach would be different. But I like that the I heard statements. I like that y'all talked about the importance of avoiding that, because it can be tricky when someone's receiving feedback and you haven't observed it. So in addition to, doing additional research, looking at it holistically, asking the team member for their thoughts too, sometimes opening the conversation with, was there anything surprising for you on your review? What did you think can be a nice segue into giving them that space to share their own thoughts on their performance? Any other groups have thoughts here?
The one thing
Juliana, just sorry, I had to unmute. I was putting a thought together. I liked it, what you said at the end, understanding a broader view of the context and not just factual. We discussed something similar in our team, focusing on facts and understanding context. Keith made a good point there. For me in Asia, understanding certain regions I was making the example in Japan and Korea, may not be as straightforward to explain sort of cultural values we see in other regions where they are more acceptable and sort of initially tolerated as a new thing, because they may have a hierarchical point of view in the country. So it's very important to, that's why I said it's important to understand the context, the wider context.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great call out. And Denise, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, so one thing I wanted to mention was, I think it came up in the group that I jumped into. All of this feedback is anonymous when you see the report for your team member. So whilst it's probably natural to want to go and find out more context and specifics from the person that gave the feedback, you actually won't be able to do that or have that information as to who supplied it. So it's thinking creatively about, you know, is this a theme that you've seen? You know, can you solicit some feedback in a safe way where from others if they've heard this or if they've witnessed or felt the same way. But it's really, really important to kind of understand your team member's perspective. Help me understand your, you know, what may have happened here to get this feedback, etc.
Thanks for calling that out, Denise. Yeah, it's not due to the anonymity factor. Not even managers will be able to see who provided feedback. It's a good thing to note.
Okay.
All right, we will jump over to scenario 2, just in the interest of time. Does anyone want to kick us off with some takeaways here?
I think Breakout Room 3 wants to tackle this.
I'll go. Okay. Let me first find our group. The contradictory feedback. I think one of the key things is, I have learned anyways, I can speak from my personal experience that we all have different views of what our values mean. So transparency doesn't mean the same thing to all of us. So I think it's quite possible that you could see contradictory feedback on what collaborative can look like based on different people's views. And so I think it kind of goes back to similar to what we found on the first one of, I think they should all, in my opinion, should all be open to discussions with the team member of, we see this feedback and well, let's talk about it. Let's talk about potentially what collaboration could look like, what good could look like, but understanding to like, how can we help you to do more and grow more and become more collaborative and more aligned with our values, and understanding that not everyone is going to see everything eye to eye, but how can we ensure that this is taken in such a way that the team member is able to find paths where they can potentially grow and continue to mature.
The other topic we talked about here was it's also important to acknowledge that you might be asking for something that the Tanuki is not able to deliver. So if you're asking an introvert to be more extroverted, or if you're asking someone who tends to be asynchronous to be more synchronous, that just might not be in their wheelhouse. And to actually discuss it and acknowledge that and say, you know, we've heard this feedback. Is that something you think you can change or want to change? If not, is there a way for you to be able to interoperate, work with your teammates in a form and fashion that would work for everyone? But I want to also kind of protect the person receiving the feedback and acknowledge that they may not be in a position to necessarily adjust their behavior, and that's okay too.
Yeah, following on that, not everything in the 360 reports is a theme, right? There are going to be an array of different pieces of strengths and improvement areas for all team members, but if it's a one-off, it's worth discussing, but it may not be worth digging too deep on if it's not a theme across the board. So great call outs, Nima and Sharad. Anything else to add on scenario 2? All right, move on to scenario 3 to wrap things up. Who wants to take us away here?
I'll actually chime in if that's okay. For scenario 3, I found it kind of interesting and basically based around sensitivity. Jane had some good points when it came to, you know, making sure once you give them the feedback, give them a minute to collect themselves, make sure to refer them to the handbook of how to take constructive feedback. So that was pretty interesting. I think this would be more around a sensitivity issue, but also being transparent and trying to walk them through everything.
We had a good conversation in our group, but there's a possibility you're going to give them this feedback in writing a week before you actually get to discuss it with them. So what's the potential ramifications or dangers of that? Like letting someone sit with really heavy feedback like this for a week without having a coach to be able to guide them through the why behind it. So maybe having the opportunity to get in front of that and give them the guidance on like focus on I think Patrick mentioned earlier, situation, behavior, impact, but focus on the behaviors and don't attach to this like this is my person that's getting attacked, so that they can look at it a little bit more neutrally versus feeling like they got attacked and then shutting down from tougher feedback.
That's a great point, Nick, because sometimes it can feel like even if it's 1 or 2 things of improvement areas and 10 for strengths, those 1 or 2 things tend to really stick out. So helping the team member look at it a little bit more holistically and things like the SBI model can be really effective. It's a great recommendation.
I thought Jeff made a really great point when he said that, if we're waiting, if you're not giving any feedback until you wait for the 360, it's your fault as a manager, because you should be communicating more proactively. And I love the way that he phrased, it should be kind of boring to the employee. You're not telling them anything that they don't already know, and they shouldn't be surprised by anything that's discussed in the 360.
I actually agree with this, Annie. I said this similar kind of thing. I said underperformance probably is not something I would put into a 360. I started doing those first reviews, and you kind of focus on areas individuals can improve. An underlying issue of underperformance probably overweighs a lot of improvement areas versus areas where they do good. So it should be communicated. Vicky made a good point as well in our group discussion, saying that it shouldn't be a surprise when it gets to this underperformance discussion. And the question is, should it be a part of the 360 or maybe before, already indicating that there is something?
Yeah, 100% that, especially between a manager and a direct report, any conversation on underperformance should happen prior, so there aren't surprises. But where it's tricky is sometimes feedback from peers can indicate a sense of underperformance, and that relationship's quite different. So navigating kind of as a manager, even if you haven't seen it, how to have those conversations can be tricky sometimes. But I think that the tips y'all have brought to the table are really effective to making sure it's productive. But yeah, absolutely. From management, there should definitely be no surprises here. All right, we've got 3 more minutes. Any other general thoughts or questions that stem from these discussions that you want to address before calling it? All right, I'll take silence as a no and give y'all 3 minutes back. Thanks so much for attending, for your vulnerability, participation. If any other questions comes up, feel free to reach out to your people business partner. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.